Welcome back to another episode of Sega Saturn exclusives. Here we're going to take a look at 8 more games that were only available on the Sega Saturn during its lifetime. I actually would cover some games here that I didn't even realize I had not covered, like Burning Rangers and Guardian Heroes. I had never touched upon their Saturn versions in any kind of review. So we're going to take a look at those and a few more. Let's get started. In early 1996, Game Arts would develop the 3D mech game Gun Griffon. I ran headlong into this one expecting a terrible game. I mean, these games were meant to be on a PC with keyboard and mouse, not restricted to a gamepad, right? My fears were completely unfounded, however, and Gun Griffon here is actually quite a competent 3D mech shooter. Set in the futuristic world of 2015, military conflict and strife have engulfed the globe. Long story short, you and your mech team are sent in to hold the line, and you are well equipped to do the job. The gameplay here takes some getting used to, and it'll frustrate you a bit upon first messing around. You have to move forward and back with the X and A buttons, while up and down on the D-pad are used for looking up and down. This is counterintuitive at first, and you'll find yourself panicking in battle and trying to press up and down to move. Once you get used to the way it wants you to play though, you find that this method works great and ultimately gives you full control over the mech. The graphics are also quite solid, with a smooth frame rate and great looking models. It does suffer from some of the technical shortcomings of the era, such as a short draw distance and ugly textures up close, but is otherwise a fine looking game. The soundtrack has sort of a standard action movie feel to it, but fits the game well enough. Gun Griffon is a game that is often overlooked on the Saturn, so I consider it a bit of a hidden gem. It plays as well as any 3D game of the era, and you can pick up the Japanese version of the game for $10 or less on eBay. There's a sequel on the Saturn as well, but we'll save that one for later. Mid-1995 would see the second half of Clockwork Night released by Sega. The first had been rushed to market to meet the demand for games just after the Japanese launch. This meant that Clockwork Night had been essentially cut in half, with Sega finishing up the rest of the game here. Once again you are Pepper, a toy knight on a quest to rescue his beloved Chelsea, the clockwork fairy princess that awakens the toys at midnight every night. If you have played the first game, you will move right into this one with no trouble at all. The gameplay feels virtually identical, with very similar stage and enemy design as well. If you remember my coverage of the first game in my Cheap Saturn Games episode, you'll recall the first game was frustratingly difficult for me. There was just something about it that made me have trouble with the last half of the game. Here, I feel the difficulty is more balanced, and I enjoyed this one more because of it. There is much more variety in regards to the things you can do as well. Some stages have you riding vehicles, some stages let you switch planes between foregrounds and backgrounds. There are more things to find within the stages, and more bonus games to boot. The graphics and sound are very similar to the first game overall, but there is more variety in effects, adding some polish to the old look. Polygon effects are used more heavily here, and you get more background interactions with enemies and bosses. Once this was released, there was a Japanese-only compilation that merged both games together back into one. This combo was the definitive version of both games, and has additional modes like a boss rush, where you can play all the bosses from both games. This was included in the US version of it, but nowhere else. All these games are very affordable in their Japanese forms and very import friendly. I've seen them go in auctions as cheap as $10, with even the compilation going for sub $30. In late 1996, Sega would drop one of the biggest surprises on the Saturn in the form of Virtual On. I never thought in a million years the Saturn could pull off this Model 2 translation with any success, and boy was I wrong. The Saturn not only did the arcade justice, but completely blew away my expectations. It ran smoothly, had great color and texture detail, and the 3D arenas looked great. The area outside the arenas needed to be cut back to 2D backdrops, but even these look great and do little to hurt the visual presentation. The one area that Virtual On has always needed patience with is the gameplay. It doesn't play like a normal brawler, and you'll need to learn how the game intends for you to play it. My advice to you is to master the dash, the jump, and the cover mechanics. You'll need to dash a lot to avoid the auto-targeting weapons, and you'll need to jump to initiate the auto lock-on system should an enemy get around you quickly. The cover mechanic is perhaps the most important for later rounds, as the aggressive AI tends to go crazy with its firepower. Use the cover the game provides, and don't be afraid to run out the clock if the CPU wants to play it that way. Virtual On also has a great soundtrack, one that fits the game incredibly well, and there are a number of tracks you'll want to listen to outside the game. The best part is that this one is as cheap as they come. Import versions are $10 or less, and for a game of this caliber, that is an absolute steal. Early in 1996, Treasure would develop one of the Saturn's most beloved games, Guardian Heroes. This 2D brawler with RPG elements is often ranked up there with the system's very best games, and to me, it deserves every accolade. This was the game that defined the Saturn hardware for me in many ways. I adored the art style and music, and the massive sprites and many enemies the engine was capable of putting on the screen confirmed the Saturn was indeed the 2D powerhouse it was supposed to be. The very center of what makes this game great is its multiplayer. You get co-op during the story, and you get an arena-style competitive mode where up to 6 players can battle it out. This mode can be fun as hell, and could almost have stood on its own, it's so good. The main story revolves around a group of rebels fighting against the evil wizard Cannon. Little do they know, Cannon is only the beginning of a much larger battle they'd be facing. What makes the story here so engaging is the fact that you have a choice of how it plays out. At various segments of the gameplay, you'll be faced with a choice of how to proceed. In many of these, it's simply what stage and enemies you'll face next. But some of them will also determine who you deem the good guys and who you deem the bad guys. This can radically change the outcome of the game and its endings, giving it incredible replay value. The gameplay is mostly centered around classic beat-em-up style controls. It goes a little deeper by giving you a block button, fighting game style special moves and magic, and the ability to jump between 3 planes of depth. I have found that the game can be extremely strategic on the harder difficulties, as just walking into enemies and bashing on them becomes far less attractive when you are taking a lot more damage in return. The use of blocking and plane switching becomes mandatory, and using your NPCs are a must. I'm also a huge fan of the graphics here. Many complain they are pixelated, but this pixel art style is gorgeous to me. And the smooth scaling with a screen full of enemies, magic and explosions really show off the Saturn's hardware. The music is also a complete win, with great variety in style and tempo. One minute you are listening to an upbeat jazz soundtrack, and the next a somber tune making you feel like something really bad is about to happen. It's all good stuff. The Japanese version of the game is quite playable, though you will miss a ton of detail from the story. A walkthrough of the choices in the game helps this, and the game is often less than half the price of the Western releases. There is also an Xbox Live version of the game on the Xbox 360 and Xbox One, which has been cleaned up and is in high definition. However you choose to play this gem of a game, I'm confident most of you will love it. Grab a friend, unleash the Golden Knight's power, and go kick some ass. A late addition in the life cycle of the Saturn, Burning Rangers would get released in early 1998, courtesy of Sonic Team. Set in the future, you are a member of the Burning Rangers, a crack team of life-saving rescue workers who brave the worst emergencies to save the day. The third-person gameplay works well here once you come to grips with the camera, which can be really irritating at first. The areas you navigate are often tight, and it's easy to get into a spot where the camera fights you every step of the way. The main objectives are to collect power crystals and save survivors of the fires. You'll need these crystals to teleport the survivors to safety, and they also act as shields should you collect enough. The main weapon has the ability to kill flames and fight the various enemies you'll come across in the game, including boss battles. A time limit moves the proceedings along swiftly, and is without question your greatest enemy in the game. The graphics in this one are technically impressive, with tons of light sourcing and great looking models. There are some notable polygon clipping issues, moments of slowdown, and the dreaded mesh transparencies are everywhere. These do not define the experience thankfully, but they are blemishes in an otherwise impressive showing. The J-pop style theme music is okay, but you'll mostly be listening to ambient explosions and burning during actual gameplay, a disappointment considering the strength of Sonic Team's usual treatment. The lone area I'd point out true disappointment is in the game's length. It's really short. Even newbies will beat the entire game in 4 or 5 hours, as it's only 4 stages long. There is a randomized level generator after you beat the story to help alleviate this, but it's still a letdown. This one was one of the very last releases for the Saturn in the West, a bittersweet swan song for a machine that should have been more successful than it was. Burning Rangers goes for hundreds of dollars for a US version, making the far cheaper Japanese version an option for many gamers. Beware of this version, however, as the language barrier leads to not being able to use the navigation call feature, which adds much more difficulty to the game, something that may, or may not, be a good thing for you.
Take a left there. Keep... Ow!
Shining the Holy Ark would be brought west by Sega in mid-1997. This first-person RPG was developed by Sonic Software Planning, who would eventually become Camelot, the developers behind many of Nintendo's Mario sports games. Back in the early days though, they were responsible for the Shining series, and this one here was a doozy. If you follow my channel at all, you know I hate pre-rendered graphics, and upon first seeing this game, I hated the presentation. I instantly turned my nose up to it and passed it by. A few years after the fact, I would run across it again, a little older, a little wiser, and a little less picky. I'd give the game a chance, and was instantly hooked. This here is a damn good RPG. You start the game as Arthur, a mercenary who is in search of a rogue by the name of Rhodey. Along with your 3 teammates, you corner him in an abandoned mine, where all hell breaks loose. You and your team get possessed. The guy who tried to kill you is now your partner, and you find out that there is a lot more to worry about than the bounty on some renegade ninja. Shining the Holy Ark is essentially a dungeon crawler that uses an interconnected map of areas you can explore. The story unfolds as you engage the new areas on your map, ultimately leading to the final showdown. You level up, equip items, and encounter random battles as you explore. I've said my piece about the graphics. I'm not a fan, but everything here runs smoothly and is very colorful at least. The music shows up here in a big way, with unforgettable battle music and great overworld and exploration tunes. I typically see this one sell for around the $80 mark for an English version. That's a bit pricey, but the game is solid enough to be worth that value. It's a great piece of Shining history, and one that is a very solid experience. Another late Western release for the Saturn, Shining Force 3 would be another Sonic/Camelot software planning developed release in the summer of 1998. This turn-based strategy game is built directly off the story from Shining the Holy Ark, with the outcome of that game playing a major role here. You begin as Symbios, a representative of the Republic of Aspinia. You are there with your colleagues to negotiate with the Empire of Destonia, when a shadow religious cult intervenes and starts a war between the two nations. You must prove that your people did not start the war as it appears, and uncover the intent behind the cult's motivations. Shining Force 3 has a great story, and unfortunately, you'll only get part of it here. Because the Saturn was failing in the West, and Sega was wanting to shed its husk as quickly as possible, we'd only see Scenario 1. We'd miss Scenario 2 and 3, which were Japanese exclusive. Sega would mess with the localization here a bit to make the story fit as one release. What's here in the Western release is still quite good, especially considering we are lucky enough to have gotten it at all. Gameplay is tried and true turn-based goodness. You'll maneuver your team around the playfield for the best positions, and unleash your attacks and magic on your foes. Battle scenes are super fast and transition smoothly from the playfield, a rarity in the 32-bit era. There are a fair number of characters to recruit, adding depth and variety to the battles. The game looks great too, with detailed models and backgrounds making up a convincing world. It's played from a slightly overhead isometric perspective, a view I'm not a big fan of, but one that serves this style of game well. Magic effects have cool light sourcing, and the textures are particularly well detailed and colorful. The music is grade A awesome, and is the kind of stuff you always remember after you play it. A North American copy of this can be gotten by a patient eBayer for around $100, and while the Japanese version of this is playable, one of the best parts of this game is the well-told and engaging story, something you'll miss going that route. Fortunately, there has been an English translation project finished for all 3 of the Japanese scenarios, giving those of you with the ability to play burn games a huge treat. I plan on covering those in the future, along with other English translated games. Ultraman Hikari no Kyojin Densetsu was released in late 1996 and published by Bandai. This 2D fighter is one of only 2 games that require a ROM cartridge, with that cartridge actually containing data for the game. It could not be replaced with the standard 1MB or 4MB RAM carts used for Capcom and SNK fighters. I was always a big fan of Godzilla movies, so knowing that the Japanese Ultraman series was about giant fighting monsters, I was instantly drawn in. And boy is this a weird game. I don't know much about the series in detail, but there appears to be variants to the Ultraman character, with some of them selectable at the start. The game is pretty simple from there. You are put into battles against monsters of varying size and fighting powers, in a battle to the death. The graphics here are a mix of 2D sprite-based fighters and polygonal foreign backgrounds. This allows the area you are fighting in to be destroyed. Buildings and trees and houses will all come crashing down as you move around. This effect is less impressive than it should be, looking more like things are deflating rather than being destroyed. The backgrounds have some nice detail, and the smooth sky effect looks nice, though I was a bit surprised the character animation wasn't more impressive given the ROM cartridge use. I know they were meant to be huge characters with imposing size, but compared to Capcom's and SNK's efforts, the animation here is virtually archaic. The gameplay is also clunky, lacking the responsiveness of better fighting games in the genre. It's solid enough to get good at once you get the timing down, and some of the special moves can be effective. It isn't Battle Monsters bad, and should appeal to those looking for a humorous 2-player game to mess around with friends or family. It's cheap too, usually selling around the $25 mark shipped. There are 3 other Ultraman branded releases for the Saturn in Japan. They are not games, but digital museums for the Ultraman universe that are compatible with the movie card. Steer clear of these unless you speak the language. You know, one of the complaints I often hear about collecting for the Saturn is that all of its best games are available on newer machines, and they're cheaper. Well, the truth of the matter is that if you do a little bit of digging, you will find that some of the Saturn's very best games are still only available on the Saturn. RPGs and strategy games like Shining the Holy Ark and Shining Force 3 cannot be played anywhere else. And both of those game series are so incredibly good. They really defined the RPG experience on the machine. Neither one of those games really are ultra expensive either. While they are up there in price, they aren't just out of reach completely. So I recommend both of them highly. I'm Sega Lord X. I really appreciate you guys watching. I'll catch you next time.